Okay, all right. Well, welcome to part 3 of the review of Science 9 for environmental chemistry now. So one of the major topics we talked about in environmental chemistry was the nitrogen cycle. There are chemicals in the environment, and they're going to have effect on the environment and the living organisms that live in it. The nitrogen cycle is required because the gaseous nitrogen that makes up about 78% or 75% of our atmosphere is not directly accessible to plants. So nitrogen fixation is just all about changing that nitrogen to a form that is more readily available to plants, and it can be done in certain ways. So, for example, nitrogen exists as N2 gas in the atmosphere, okay, and it can be broken down in various ways. For example, lightning can break nitrogen down and make it into oxides, which are readily available to plants. But nitrogen fixation, typically what we talk about in our class, happens at this level here, at the level of the roots, okay? And inside there are some bacteria that are called rhizomes, and they take the nitrogen and they fix it. In other words, they make it into how can I say, into a form that's available for plants, and then it's able to be taken up by the plants. This is an important topic that you do need to know about it. Okay, so bacteria in root nodules convert free nitrogen to the useful compounds. The uptake of nitrogen occurs by plants. Consumers will eat plants containing nitrogen. When animals deposit waste back to the soil, that nitrogen is made available to the soil, and decomposers will break down the waste and release nitrogen compounds into the soil. Free nitrogen in the air again is broken down by lightning, as shown there. So that's something that we definitely need to make sure that we know about for that exam, and also for your future courses, because you will revisit it again. So chemicals do enter the environment. One way that they do it is fertilizer application. So fertilizer applications, you have the NPK value. So nitrogens, phosphates, and potassium are added to soil as fertilizer, and they will dissolve in water, forming leachate or leachate. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Some of this will run off into streams and lakes and have an effect on the environment. So for example, this lawn fertilizer that I have indicates that it's 12% nitrogen, 3% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. High phosphorus aids in root and flower growth. High nitrogen aids in leaf and stem growth. And high potassium aids in disease resistance and early growth. So each of these are going to do something different for the plant. That's important to understand. So another way that chemicals enter the environment is through solid waste. Solid waste is just garbage. And when garbage is deposited, chemicals can move into the soil when it rains. Also, that happens with wastewater. Chemicals also enter the environment through spraying of herbicides and fungicides to help control weeds and pests. Combustion is a big one, with the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels that produces smog, and smog can again dilute itself or dissolve in rain and produce acid rain. So sour gas is another one that releases sulfur dioxide into the air, and sulfur dioxide along with the nitrogen oxides are responsible for creating that acid rain. So industrial processes also are involved in pollution, so electrical power generation, mineral processing, and fertilizer production. In Alberta, there's a natural gas processing to remove sour gas, which would release sulfur dioxide into the air, as I indicated. Okay, another important topic we talked about are acids and bases. Acids and bases are two classes of chemicals that sort of cancel each other out. And they're indicated here by the pH scale, which is pretty important. You're going to learn more about this as you get into high school. Any pH with a number of 7 is said to be neutral. Any pH with a number that is greater than 7 is said to be basic, and any substance with a pH of less than 7 is said to be acidic. Now, the different substances here are given to you as an example of, what is acidic, what is basic. So lemon juice is an acid, and baking soda is a base. So this I have up here is one of the tools that we use to determine what is an acid, what is a base. And this is the universal indicator that we use in the lab. So a universal indicator is just a piece of paper that you can dip into your substance, and then that will have a color change. And based on that color change, you can go ahead and compare it to any of these colors and kind of estimate what the pH would be. It's not the best, but it certainly is one of the better ways to measure pH, especially when you're comparing it to these two guys here, where you have blue litmus paper and red litmus paper. Now, blue litmus paper will turn red in the presence of an acid, but it will remain blue if it's dipped into a base. Likewise, for the red litmus paper, if it's dipped into an acid, it will remain red. If it's dipped into a base, it will turn blue. The best way to measure whether something is an acid or a base is right here, this guy here, which is very similar to what we have in our school, and that's a pH meter. Okay. Another thing that's important with acids and bases that you have to understand is neutralization. So when we add an acid to a base, we cancel each other out almost, right? So an acid typically has a low pH, and a base has a higher pH. So if we add those two together, the tendency, of course, is for that pH to go to the neutral 7. And there are certain distinct products that are always able to be predicted when you're talking about acid-base reactions. So if I have an acid and I add it to a base, and I will get what's called a salt and water. And this is typically what's called a double replacement reaction. You'll learn more about double replacement reactions in grade 10. But all it is there's a swapping going on. So this chlorine is swapping with this hydroxyl group, and you get the formation of sodium chloride and water. And if you wonder how water is, like, I'll give you a hint right now. When you're doing chemistry in more advanced courses, don't write water as H2O, write it as HOH. It'll be a lot easier for you to actually do the chemistry. Okay, that's my advice to you. Just take it or leave it, but I think if you write water as HOH rather than H2O, you'll make it easier for you to do the chemistry. So that's acids and bases in a nutshell. Okay, another really interesting topic is the types of organic molecules. Here we have what's called the carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are responsible for producing or supplying energy for cells of all organisms. Major sources of carbohydrates include rice, grains, potatoes, fruits. Plants and some microorganisms can produce their own carbohydrates through photosynthesis. And this molecule here is what's called an amino acid. An amino acid is the basic building block of proteins. So proteins are just large chains of amino acids. And amino acids, you can recognize them because they contain nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Whereas carbohydrates up here just contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So proteins, these guys here, they're responsible for the growth and repair of cell tissues, of cells. they're undergoing any kind of damage. So typically you'll find protein in meats, eggs, dairy products, legumes, and nuts. Up here in the top right hand corner we have fat. So fat is made up of fatty acids, so all of these carbon and hydrogens connected together are are fatty acids that are chained to a molecule of glycerol, and they're used for protecting organs and giving structure to the cell membrane, and it's also used for energy storage. So major sources of fats are oils. You find them in dairy, animal tissue, that sort of thing. You'll find fats. And there's two kinds of fats, just for interest. There are saturated and unsaturated fats. And saturation has to do with the amount of hydrogen that's on these molecules here. You'll learn more about this when you get into advanced chemistry, but if you have double bonds in between the carbons here, then you have less hydrogens, right? And with less hydrogens, it's said to be desaturated, which is unsaturated fats. So that's the difference. So when people are talking about saturated and unsaturated fats, they're talking chemically about the number of hydrogens in the molecules. Another class of organic molecules that kind of fall in on its own in terms of you don't typically go out of your way to eat to consume it, as these are example of macromolecules, large molecules that we need for nutrition. These are nucleic acids, and nucleic acids are involved in DNA and RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA stands for ribonucleic acid, and they contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and they're responsible for transmission of the inheritance genetic material. Okay, some inorganic substances. Inorganic substances are also called minerals, and the thing about it is that they don't really contain carbon. Okay, so we've got nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and sulfur, and it's a really, really good idea. Okay, in fact, you should know what each of these nutrients do in both plants and animals, right? In plants, nitrogen is going to make up protein, it's going to make up the chlorophyll, and it's involved in the nitrogen cycle. Whereas in animals, we'll find nitrogen in protein, and we'll find them in nucleic acids. So nitrogen is involved in the growth and repair of cell tissue, but it's also involved in inheritance as well. And you can just go down, I have potassium highlighted here, but for no particular reason, but very important in humans for proper nerve impulses. It's also very important for insulin uptake as well. Just out of interest, calcium, your heart cannot beat without a proper level of calcium. Not a lot of people know that, but people typically do know that it is responsible for giving our bones and teeth strength and structure. So make sure you know this. Make sure you know what each of these do for plants and animals. Okay, so now that we know that there are chemicals in the environment, these chemicals can have positive effects as well, and organisms need to take them in. So there are a few ways that organisms take it in. So for example, humans, mammals, we will ingest these nutrients. Plants, on the other hand, it happens differently, and in our small intestine, these processes that I'm about to talk about are also go in play. So one is diffusion. This is going back to grade 7, I believe, definitely grade 8 science. So the first one is diffusion. And diffusion is just a simple concept. It's the movement of substances. So if you're talking calcium, if you're talking potassium, if you're talking sodium, it's the movement of these substances from an area where you're going to find a lot of potassium, calcium, or sodium. So an area where there's a lot of that stuff to an area where there's not so much of that stuff, right? It's just kind of natural in a way. So think of these as individual human beings, right? And let's say this is all crowded. Well, if it's getting crowded, it might be a little bit uncomfortable for some people, and it just makes sense that they want to go to an area where there's more space, right? That's natural, right? No energy is required for that, right? That's why it's called facilitated diffusion, right? Well, actually, no, sorry. Facilitated diffusion is something else. But that's why it's just called diffusion, because it doesn't really require any energy. It's just a natural flow of substances going from a high concentration area to an area of low concentration. With facilitated diffusion, if this happens across a membrane, which typically it does, sometimes you find these large protein molecules that are embedded within the membrane that open up as sort of a channel, and it helps molecules to move across an area from an area of high concentration to low concentration, but they're just too big to get through that membrane, and so the protein just kind of helps open up a channel that's big enough for those molecules to move across the membrane. The next one is osmosis. So osmosis is a type of diffusion. So if you understand diffusion, you can understand osmosis. The only thing that's special about osmosis is it is specifically talking about the movement of water from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. Okay, so diffusion is the movement of particles. Osmosis is the movement of water. Okay, so let's see if we can understand what's going on in this diagram here. So what we have is we have a container of fluid that's separated by a semi-permeable membrane. Partially permeable or semi-permeable just means that it's going to allow certain things to cross and not allow other things to cross. So the blue highlights the water molecules, and the red highlights the sugar molecules. And so this is selectively permeable to water. In other words, it will allow water to move across the membrane, but not sugar. Sugar is too large of a molecule. Okay, so it's going to allow water. So if we take a look at this side here and compare it to this side, we notice that there are 1, 2, 3 molecules of sugar, right? And there's a lot more water here compared to this side. So we would say that this side is the high concentration of water, right? And this is the low concentration of water because we have a lot of solute there. So that means that if water moves from an area of high concentration of water to an area of low concentration of water, then the natural progression is to go from right to left. And that's why over time we'll see a decrease in the amount of water, on this side of the membrane compared to this side. Okay. So both diffusion and osmosis were taught to you in grade 7 and grade 8, especially grade 8 science. But now, in grade 9, this is a new concept introduced to you. And active transport involves movement of molecules in the opposite direction. So in both examples of diffusion and osmosis, I indicated to you that it is the movement of particles and water, respectively, from an area of high concentration to low concentration, right? But in this case, sometimes we need to move substances from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So against what's called the concentration gradient, right? It's kind of against the way things just naturally want to go. So because we're going in a direction where things are, it's not natural to go this way, we need to spend some energy, right? We need to pay the price, okay, of admission, so to speak, right? So that's like how things move in that direction from low to high concentration. So usually it is through a channel, through a carrier protein. And in this is a great diagram here. So with energy, typically it's involved in a molecule called ATP. You'll learn more about that in other courses. So ATP allows this protein to open up, for example, and then this molecule that wants to be transported will bind right there. It fits right nicely. You can see right there, right? And what happens with that, when this binds to that, it just changes the shape of this protein structure, and it'll allow it to kind of change its shape, and then it'll allow that molecule to kind of leave the other way. Okay, so the whole thing is that you're going from low to high with active transport. This is a beautiful drawing. Okay, another very, very important topic that I have repeated over and over again throughout all the unit, the whole unit. And it's this whole idea of biomagnification, bioaccumulation. And we had some examples of it. DDT was a big example. Mercury was a big example as well. And PCBs are also a big example. So in this example, all it is that DDT was used way back in the day to take care of mosquitoes because they wanted to decrease the onset of malaria in people. And it took care of the mosquitoes. That was great. Unfortunately, it had a big impact on the environment because, as you see here, DDT in water constitutes a very, very small percentage, right? There's 0.000003 parts per million of DDT in water. But what happens is that when the zooplankton drinks all that water, right, the zooplankton is actually taking in a lot of DDT because there's so much of it in the water, right? So that means that the concentration of DDT in zooplankton increases. Well, the fish, the small fish who eat all the zooplankton, eat a whole bunch of zooplankton. So if they're eating a whole bunch of zooplankton, that means they're getting even more DDT, right? So then you see that, we start to see that number, that part per million number getting bigger and bigger, being larger and larger, right? So then when the small fish are eaten by the large fish, they get even more DDT, okay? And then you get right up to the top of the food chain, and these guys have the most amount of DDT in their systems compared to things that are on the bottom of the food chain. And with respect to eagles, it was really, really bad because DDT is going to affect the integrity of the shell of their eggs. So things in nature happen. You know, eggs fall out, and because the eggshell is not hard enough to protect the chick, what ends up happening is the chick dies because the shell breaks. And if the shell breaks, the chick dies, the population of the eagle decreases. Okay, so that's very important. And just remember, it doesn't just happen with DDT. It happens with mercury. It happens with PCBs as well. Okay, we talked about a substrate. It's a material on which an organism moves or lives. So here you have moss. The substrate of the moss would be the rock. Okay, monitoring water quality. We talked about this is section 2 now. Monitoring water quality. Clarity is not a good indicator. So one of the things that we use are biological monitoring. In other words, scientists look at the organisms that naturally live in an aquatic environment, and they look at their population number. So if we have an increase or a decrease in the population, scientists will look and infer that something is going on in the environment to cause that change. So for example, in a healthy lake, you'll find a variety of vertebrates, invertebrates, and plants, and that's generally the rule. If you look at an ecosystem, the healthier the ecosystem, the more diverse organisms you're going to find. So in a polluted lake, you'll find fewer fish and invertebrates and more worms because they have to leave or they die off, and that's their good biological monitors or indicators that tell you that something is up with the water quality. So chemical factors affecting organisms include dissolved oxygen, right? The greater dissolved oxygen, the more variety you're going to get. The less dissolved oxygen, the less variety you're going to get. Okay, the less organisms are going to live there. Acidity, as the pH increases, the level of oxygen decreases. Heavy metals like mercury and lead, Hg is mercury, Pb is lead, again are involved in biomagnification. Plant nutrients, pesticides, and herbicides, these are all factors that affect the amount of organisms that you're going to find in a aquatic environment. Okay, parts per million. So this is how we communicate and measure the amount of toxic substances in a given amount of in an area, right? So how do you calculate this? And you'll have to remember how to do this because you're not going to get this formula in the on your sheet, right? So in parts per million, translated from this to math is just part x, we don't know, per that line, a million. Okay, so 2, 3, 1, 5, 6. Okay, so how do we go 1,000 to a million? We have to multiply by 1,000. Okay, and whatever you use to the bottom, you have to do the same thing to the top. You can multiply that by 1,000, and so your parts per million is that you have 12,000 parts per million. Okay. You can also have parts per trillion and parts per billion, and don't be fooled by it. The calculation is the exact same thing. Just billion and trillion, you'll have more zeros. So a billion is going to be how many zeros? That's right, 9 zeros. A trillion is going to be, okay, 6, 9, and what comes after 9? If we're going in threes, that's right, 12. I think that's 12 zeros. So there you go. So if you're doing parts per billion or parts per trillion, this number would be replaced by these ones respectively. Okay, levels of dissolved oxygen are going to depend on the temperature. The higher the temperature, the less dissolved oxygen. Turbulence due to the wind or the speed of moving water. If you have more turbulence, then that's just going to increase the amount of oxygen that's being dissolved. The amount of photosynthesis by plants and algae in the water, more photosynthesis. Of course, one of the products of photosynthesis is dissolved oxygen, so you're going to get more oxygen with more photosynthesis. The amount of chemical pollution, more pollution means you're going to have decreased dissolved oxygen. And of course, increased acidity means less dissolved oxygen as well. The number of organisms using up the oxygen, if you have more and more organisms that are using oxygen, well, that's just going to deprive other organs of oxygen. So more organisms means less dissolved oxygen. And I think it's a really good idea for you guys to take a look at these numbers here and just give yourself a pretty good idea of how much oxygen you'll find where you find certain effects, right? So if you have 8 parts per million of oxygen, then you get nice diversity, but then something 2 parts per million, and only the small organisms can survive. Okay, LD50. LD50 stands for lethal dose 50, and it is a dose of a substance where 50% of your sample will die. So let's say we have a substance, and I'm making this number up. Let's say we have 0.5 milligrams per kilogram of a rat. We're going to get, so let's say 1 kilogram of a rat, we would give 0.5 milligrams. So let's say we have a rat or a mouse that weighs 2 kilos. Okay, I don't even know how big that is. So if you have 2 kilos, then it's 0.5 times 2, that would be 1 milligram. Okay, so if we give it to 100 rats, then if it's LD50, we would expect 50 of them to die. Okay, so this is very important when you're measuring the toxicity of substances like mercury, which is a heavy metal, and it's implicated in Minamata disease, which was talked about in class. So Minamata disease is a neurological disorder that affected many Japanese people that were from Minamata, and they worked at a factory where many of these substances were dumped into the water supply there. And of course, things are always going to be more toxic to children and the elderly than they are to adults. But that's so air quality is the last section we talked about. So we have to take ways to measure air quality, and we have to look at certain things. So carbon monoxide is something that's important to look out for. Clear, colorless, dangerous gas. Carbon dioxide is, we don't want too much carbon dioxide. Sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides will produce acid rain together. Ground level ozone is pretty interesting. Ozone is great in the upper atmosphere. We need it to protect us from the harmful UV rays, but it's colorless and odorless, and it's made up of 3 oxygens. It forms reactions between oxygen, nitrogen oxides, and compounds called volatile organic compounds, VOCs. So VOCs are organic chemicals that evaporate easily. Some plants and trees emit them, but most of the VOCs come from human-made products like gases and solvents and stuff. So these volatile organic compounds react with the ozone, and it can cause harmful effects. The greenhouse effect is a natural thing because the carbon dioxide is naturally produced, and so that just traps in some of the heat in the earth. So here's the earth, and we have some of the sun's rays. I should probably change the color, but sun's rays, and it just bounces off the surface and it comes back towards, and the atmosphere kind of traps it in, right? And that's a natural thing that happens. However, if we have more and more CO2 building up, then we get the enhanced greenhouse effect, where this sort of phenomena gets worse. Okay, CFCs, and of course it produces global warming, because if you're trapping in the heat, then the temperature, average temperature of the Earth does increase. The CFCs is the ozone layer thinning. So this thins out the ozone layer, and it's a concern because if it thins out the ozone layer, then we won't have anything protecting us from harmful UV rays. Okay, how does substances get transported? Well, they get transported through the release, dispersion, deposition, and leaching, and that's groundwater contamination. So that's how it happens. It's just released from a source, it's scattered in many directions, then it falls to the ground or gets into the water, and that's called deposition. Wind direction and the speed are going to influence where the pollution lands, and also if it gets into precipitation. If it gets into precipitation, it's not going to travel as far as it would if the wind just carries it. Okay. So other ways that substances are transported through the soil and groundwater through leaching. And these are other ways that there are ways that the concentration of substances are decreased. So one is dilution. So in other words, if a substance is added to a large body of water, or if it's diluted when it's treated, then you're going to find less of that molecule per unit volume. Okay, so diluting just means you're adding more solvent. So if I have, a glass here containing, let's say, these kind of chemicals here, right? All of this is chemicals, and I dilute it by adding more water, then all I'm doing is I'm spreading out. Okay, let's say I add more water up to here. Then all I'm doing is I'm just kind of spreading out the particles, so that if I take a snapshot here, I'll find fewer particles than if I take the same kind of snapshot. Let me just cheat a bit here. If I take the same kind of snapshot here, right, I find more. So that's what dilution is. Okay. Another way is biodegradation. So this is just bacteria breaking things down. Phytoremediation. Phyto means plants. So you can grow plants in an area where there is increased concentration of a deadly substance, and the plants, as they grow, they absorb this toxic substance, and then afterwards we can just get rid of the plants. That's phytoremediation. Photolysis is a really cool thing where you have light breaking down substances, and it's kind of cool because you can break down, let's say, nitrogen monoxide, right, in the presence of light will be broken down, plus light will be broken down to nitrogen and gas and oxygen, right? So this is not a balanced equation, but that's just an example. And what's really good about it is, right, we breathe in oxygen, I'll just make that, and nitrogen just goes back to nitrogen fixation. Okay, I think that's all I got for Unit C. That is quite a long video. What can I say? I'm passionate about science, and anyway, okay, we'll see you for Unit D.